A Nova Scotia fishing village at dawn. It's the opening day of the lobster season, and the fishermen are just beginning to set their traps on the Bay of Fundy. There are a lot of myths about the Atlantic fishery. The press is full of stories about the collapse of fisheries and communities, and the bleak future faced by people who have been driven out of the industry. But forced out by what? The recent history of the Atlantic fishery is the story of the transformation of a common property resource into a regulated commodity. Today, fisheries are regulated by a system in which fish quotas are bought and sold on the open market. Today, a fisherman or woman may sit in an office paying others to fish a quota. The lobster fishery is the last remaining fishery not regulated by such a system. But commodification has also transformed this last bastion of the small boat inshore fishery. You see, lobster licenses are now worth upwards of $1 million. Fred Horner fishes out of Port Maitland, Nova Scotia in the District 34 lobster fishery. This is one of the most lucrative fisheries in Canada, so the season opening on the last Monday of November is high drama. In fact, the opening weeks can make or break a fishing operation. Fishing is Fred's life, and like many Nova Scotia fishermen, he's been at it since he was a boy. This would be your, 40th year setting out here on this first of December?
I left school at 14 years old. I had fished with Dad. I'd helped him set and went for, a few days and then went back to school for a couple years. Now, I was only 14 when I quit school. So I was probably 12, 13, and I helped Dad set and I went out and fished with him. But I quit school at 14.
Oh.
Now I'm 51. That's 37 years that I've been doing this racket. And when I first started lobster fishing was just something to do in the wintertime. It was no big deal. It was just something to do in the wintertime. If you liked it, you did it. If you didn't like it, you didn't do it. Well, we liked it, we did it. And but it's turned into it's turned me into a millionaire. I'm a millionaire.
When Fred says that he's a millionaire, he describes a powerful irony in the Atlantic fishery, an irony that touches everyone who works in Canada's resource industries. This is Fred's son, Justin, and he faces a very different set of circumstances in the contemporary small boat fishery. I got to know Fred when I taught his children in elementary school, and he wondered if his boys would be able to continue the family tradition in the fishery. So in the early hours of the morning on opening day, it would seem as though Fred should be well satisfied with the way things have turned out. His fishing rig and license are now worth around $1 million, and in addition to Justin, Fred's son-in-law, John, and second son, Josh, who now attends Memorial University in Newfoundland, are working with him in the family business. It seems as though Fred's dream has come true. So how did Fred become a millionaire? When he got into the fishing industry in the mid-1970s, the industry was expanding and industrializing. At the time, the Canadian government saw the fishery as an undercapitalized, seasonal industry, employing too many people on a temporary basis. So, interest-free loans and other incentives were provided to fishermen to build bigger boats and to invest in new technologies using mobile gear that increased the catches astronomically. The results were partly predictable. Big corporate fish ate small fish, and many people were forced out of the industry, allegedly in the name of efficiency and progress. So what's happened to the value of the license since those days when you say the lobster license was worth nothing?
Well, the value of like I don't know what year it was that they what's the word, so you can't get any more. They were
Cut off.
yeah, but
Suspended.
No, they were
Limited entry.
limited entry. I just forget what year that was, but they made it a limited entry fishery. And I don't know of anybody, any fisherman, or I don't ever recall ever going to any meetings and demanding a limited entry fishery. I think it was most of the government. I'm not sure. I might have to ask some older people whether maybe what they used to do years ago when you was getting your license, they would ask you a question like, you know, do you favor Sunday fishing or something like that, and the majority, they would go with majority. So maybe when they were getting their licenses, Jesus, I never ever was asked that questions, and I had my license before the limited entry. So I don't know why they made it limited. It's just like the old story, conservation. That's why ITQs are supposed to be conservation, but limited fishery. And this is what I mean, we're getting around to answering your question about the price of the license. Anyway, so that was the first thing, it became limited. But it didn't drive up the price of the licenses.
Yeah.
Not back then. I mean, if the boat always went with a license. If an old fellow would get out of the industry, if he didn't have a kid to give it to, we sold it for what it was worth. The license was still not brought into it. I mean, because fishing was down. We'd fish all day. We'd go out and haul all day and bring them ashore in a bucket. Nobody really wanted to get into the industry until I would have to say probably the last 15 years, something like that. And what we figured is the collapse of the ground fishery that brought the lobsters back, because it's like the fox and the rabbits. The collapse of the ground fishery that were eating all the baby lobsters before they got a chance to grow, so there was no lobsters. But lobsters has come back, and so therefore, with it being a limited entry and lobsters coming back,
big catches.
Big catches. Well, they had a buyback. The government started buying licenses back before these big catches. For some reason, well, conservation, I thought, and they paid up to $2,000 or $3,000, and some guys even sold for that. And then it got up to a little bit more money, these buybacks from the government. Now, I don't know how high the buybacks ever got, but then the licenses were being purchased because the catch was coming up, you know. The licenses were being purchased for, you know, $40,000, $50,000. Jesus, some guys thought that was a lot of money. Some guys that had, you know, fished a lot of bad years, never made any money. $50,000 sounded pretty good.
Fred didn't take the money. He survived the commodification of fishing licenses. Those on the margins of the fishery were forced out, and their stories are well known. Whole communities full of people whose identities were tied up in the fishery were cut adrift and became casualties. As more and more people left the industry and Nova Scotia's coastal communities, survivors like Fred and the families that remain fishing these boats face increasing pressure. Increasing pressure to take the bait and sell out. And who can afford to buy a lobster license these days? Not those who have traditionally become fishermen. Who has $1 million to buy a lobster license? Fred and many other fishermen fear that one of the last family fisheries in Canada will follow the ground fishery and the scallop fisheries and become virtual monopolies controlled by a handful of corporate players. They fear that Nova Scotia's $370 million lobster industry is an attractive market, waiting to be cornered. So the $1 million value of his license is a kind of curse to Fred, representing a powerful inducement, drawing him away from his work, his traditions, something about which he has deep knowledge, in short, his culture. I didn't understand Fred's position until I finally listened to what he was saying about fishing and what it means to him. I taught school in the 1990s in Fred's home community of Sandy Cove, and for many years I wondered about two things. First of all, license-holding fishing families I knew seemed to do very well financially, and yet there was a deep sense of unease and even fear when I talked with fishermen about their industry and its future. The other thing that I wondered about was why so many young men chose this way of life, if it was so precarious and such hard work. One day, over a game of pool, I said to Fred that most people have a hard time feeling sorry for a millionaire. He paused, and then he asked me what I'd do if someone came along and offered me $1 million for my teaching credentials. $1 million for my formal education. Would I allow myself to be bought out in mid-career for $1 million? Could I walk away from an identity, an education, in which I had invested my whole life for $1 million? How would I rebuild my world? Who would I be? Where would I go? And then Fred asked me another question that complicated things even further. He asked, what if you could pass your teaching credentials along to your children when you were finished with them? Fred caused me to realize that a fishing license is more than a commodity. It is a way of life, a culture, an education, an identity. It is not unlike my own education, my own identity, and my own way of life. Like my formal education and my identity as a teacher, Fred's education and life's work as a fisherman on the Bay of Fundy is a connection to a culture and a life world that he has trouble imagining living outside.
I'm scared. That $1 million they're talking about is of no interest to me. Not one bit. But my biggest fear is 5 years from now, if they continue buying these licenses up and they get control of them, it won't be. They'll just look at me and they'll say, "We don't want your officers." That's a fear. I'm not afraid of losing the $1 million. That doesn't mean shit. But I'm afraid of losing the privilege. I'll probably still have the privilege. I can go, but what are we going to do with my lobsters? When I come in, am I going to take them home and eat them? You know, or something like that. I mean, that's the thing that scares me. Should I keep it or should I sell it? Should I keep it or should I sell it? I don't want to sell it.
My life in the university and in schools is also a deep connection to a cultural space as well. No more, no less. Like many middle-class professionals, I work as hard as I can to pass these connections to this culture on to my own children. Fred and I both define ourselves and defend our families when we do this. Through a long, continuing apprenticeship, Fred has taught his boys who they are, where they are, and how to survive and prosper as he has. Fred and I both understand that our children need an education. As Fred points out, $1 million is just money. Money that gets eaten up in taxes and consumption. His life as a fisherman is worth more than that. His children and his heritage are wealth, and they're worth more than $1 million. You don't want to be a millionaire.
I don't want to be a millionaire. I can't afford to be a millionaire. That's not an investment. That's an investment that's downhill.
Yeah.
If I can stay in the business myself for another few more years. Justin lives, you know where Justin lives. He lives just a rock throw from me. I want his children to come up through that path, between my place, that path, and come over and visit me, and me and Debbie. And I want to be with them in the business as long as I can. And I want them to